What's up guys, it's Eric from Americani, and today I'll be going over my tournament report for the recent regional held in Charlotte, North Carolina. I just got back from the tournament this past weekend, so I want to do a report while the tournament was still a bit fresh in my mind. So I'll be covering everything from the meta leading up to the tournament, to my deck choice, and basically everything else in between as well. And in case you guys didn't know, I actually live in South Carolina, so I was actually pretty stoked to see the Carolinas finally get their own regional after all these years. So I went to this event, really hoping to do well to try to represent for my home region if possible. So the format for this event was standard format, which means cards all the way back from Breakthrough up to the most recent set, Ultra Prism, were going to be legal for play, which was actually the same format for the last regional I attended in Collinsville, Illinois as well. And even though these events have the same format, there are a few big things differentiating these two tournaments that would really affect my potential deck choice for this event. So if you guys remember correctly, the regional held in Collinsville was actually among one of the first tournaments where Ultra Prism was going to be legal for play, which has a huge impact on the metagame you would expect to see. At the time leading up to that event, several new archetypes like Magnezone, Garchomp, and Polion Glaceon were some of the more hyped and new decks going into the event that you expect to see play. But now that several major tournaments have been held in the new format, the metagame is solidified a bit, weeding out some of those new decks that previously had some hype and maybe didn't do as well as they had hoped. And with also Zoroark winning that regional and Buzzwole Garb also emerging as a more legitimate deck, picking a deck I knew would be much more complicated than just sleeving up what I played for that event. So going into this event, I knew a handful of decks would especially be popular, most notably Zoroark variants and Buzzwole variants. But as far as Zoroark goes, there were three main versions I knew would turn out in large numbers, and that being Golisopod, Lycanroc, and Guardies, probably in that order as well, based on their performances and popularity at other recent tournaments. And also Tapu Bulu and Fire variants seemingly never disappear from the format, no matter what the meta looks like, so I thought it would be safe to assume they would pop up in some capacity as well. Online, Ho-Oh GX specifically seemed to have a bit of talk around it, so I expected, what Fire variants that did appear at the tournament to lean more on Ho-Oh and Kiawe, rather than the old school Volcanion style lists. Garbodor was also a very popular card at Collinsville, most notably with Espeon GX, but with Golisopod's success at Collinsville, I feel like Espeon probably would be pushed out of popularity, and instead players would probably focus more on Buzzwole as a partner for Garbodor, if at all. So with that in mind, that then begs the question, what deck would actually be a good pick for Charlotte? So if you guys saw my Collinsville, Illinois tournament report, you'll know that I did play Espeon Garb. At that tournament, I thought it was a really good pick going into the event. Buzzwole had a lot of hype going into that event, and just generally it had really decent matchups across the board. You didn't really auto-win many matchups, but you really didn't lose many matchups either, so I thought that was a great pick for that tournament. But, Espeon Garb, I think, traditionally has not been the best against Golisopod variants. And unfortunately, Golisopod GX won Collinsville, Illinois, which means I can't really, I think, safely fall back on Espeon Garb as a deck to pick up for the event. So unfortunately, I couldn't just sleeve up the last deck I played and take it to this event, even though it was the same regional. Like I said, the metagame had kind of shifted since then. So that forced me to really start picking up a lot of different decks and, trying to figure out what might be a good play. One thing I've talked about before is I really enjoy these types of regionals too, where, the meta is very well defined at this point. People kind of have an idea of what is going to show up, which means you can actually get a little bit more creative with the decks that you want to bring to the event, since you can pick stuff that just kind of counters the metagame. So I think that's something that's really fun, and I've definitely experimented with leading up to this event. Online, there was some talk around the Silvally GX variant I posted about. I actually posted the deck as part of our Rogue Rumble series. I'll put a link to that video if you want to see that. But, I took an updated version of that list to Elite Cup, did well at it. So there was some talk around Silvally GX as a potential way to counter the metagame, since it has all the different memory cards, and there's various different good basic Pokemon that you could compare with it. But the variant that I was testing a lot was Silvally GX with Dawnwing's Necrozma, actually, which seems like a very unlikely partner. So that was a deck I actually put a decent amount of hours into and was feeling pretty good about, but unfortunately leading up to the event, Zoroark Lycanroc GX actually had a good amount of hype, since it had kind of a slightly favorable matchup against the Golisopod variant. So that kind of really deterred me from playing this Silvally GX deck, since the Lycanroc version of Zoroark is a lot harder for Silvally to deal with. It's definitely not unwinnable by any means, but if I'm trying to counter the metagame with a Silvally GX deck, I just didn't think that one would be the best way to go if I wanted to counter the metagame. So I had to kind of cross that one off my list. I think it was a solid deck, and honestly, I think it does have a potential to beat a lot of stuff in the metagame, but I didn't really want to lose to a deck that was seeing a lot of hype going into this event. And also, I tested everything from Giurleo GX to Duskmane, Necrozma, Magnezone to like all sorts of weird stuff, and I was really just struggling to find a deck that I really liked. I was actually enjoying Duskmane Necrozma Garbiter. That was a deck I really was having a lot of fun with, but unfortunately the deck really struggled with dealing with Tapu Koko, which seems like a really strange thing, but with the deck that just won Collinsville playing Tapu Koko, I didn't really want to play a deck that would struggle against that. Tapu Koko is just a very hard card for the Duskmane Garbiter deck to really get around and deal with. As odd as that sounds, it's such a simple card, but it really just made that deck, I think, struggle a little bit for me. So with only a few days left leading up to the event, there was a few decks in particular in the meta that I really just didn't want to play. I didn't want to play Zoroark GX just because it had kind of a target on its head, and I just wasn't a big fan of how the deck played. It's a really good deck, I just didn't enjoy it. I know that seems like kind of a petty reason not to pick up a deck, but I just didn't want to play a deck I didn't enjoy playing for 9 rounds. Same thing for Buzzwole. Buzzwole I definitely think is one of the best decks in format, but I'm just not a fan of the big basic decks most of the time, so I knew I didn't want to play Buzzwole either. Again, just not my play style. I didn't want to play a deck I hated for 9 rounds. So leading up to the event, I actually started testing Zoroark Lycanroc. I thought it had a solid Golisopod matchup. And also, I thought it just had generally solid answers to most decks in the current format. Even Buzzwole, you can play things like Mew EX or the Mewtwo from Evolutions to help that matchup as well. So it was a deck I kind of likened to Espeon Garb for Collinsville. It's a deck that I thought had 50-50 matchups or better against most things in the format. You lose to things like mill decks, but I really didn't expect to play a lot of those, so Zoroark Lycanroc was actually looking like a good deck going into this event. It's actually what I ultimately decided on playing. So let's go ahead and I'll actually just take you through the entire deck list that I used for this event as well. So just at first glance, I think this list doesn't look, too crazy different from a lot of the other Zoroark Lycanroc decks that you've probably seen in the past. But let's go through the deck and I'll take you through, some of the similarities and some of the differences between other versions. So looking at the Pokemon line, we are playing a 4-4 Zoroark GX line. I'm not opting to play things like Evo Soda in this deck, so I didn't really feel comfortable playing 3 Zoroark GX. I know some people in the past, including the Zoroark Lycanroc deck that did well, I believe top 8 at Collinsville, only played the 3 Zoroark GX, so without Evo Soda, I really just didn't want to play the 3. I wanted to max that out at 4th, that way we can start trading and, get set up as quick as possible. I also played one of the Baby Zoroark back from Breakthrough. Looking at my Rockruff counts, I actually played 2 of the promo Rockruff and 1 of the Rockruff from Guardians Rising that had the corner attack, and then of course 2 Lycanroc GX from Guardians Rising as well, not the other one, not the promo one. We're playing the one with Bloodthirsty Eyes, that way we can choose what we want to take knockouts on and do big damage with Dangerous Rogue GX as well. But then also looking at the text in this list, I'm actually playing 2 different ways to counter Buzzwole. That is the Mewtwo from Evolutions and Mew EX. I thought Buzzwole Garb had a good bit of hype going into this event. It was a kind of a new Buzzwole variant that I think really got legitimized after Collinsville, so I was kind of worried if I did face Buzzwole Garb and they were locking my abilities, I still wanted to have a reliable counter to deal with Buzzwole. So that's why I played both the Mew and Mewtwo. Mewtwo is more for Buzzwole Garb, and Mew EX was more for the Buzzwole Lycanroc style variant, but basically 2 outs against Buzzwole decks. And then, of course, 3 Tapu Lele to round out the Pokemon line. Also, looking at the energy, played 4 Double Colorless, 3 Fighting, and 2 Strong energy. A lot of people were even cutting their Strongs down to only 1 count. In some cases, 0. Fellow PokeTuber Team Fish Knuckles actually played the same deck and played 0 Strong energy in his list. So people were very aware of Enhanced Hammer for this event. But I still felt like playing the 3 Fighting, 2 Strong was going to be fine. Originally I started out with 3 Strong, but because of Enhanced Hammer, I wanted to tweak my count and lean a little bit heavier on Fighting energy as opposed to Strong energy in this list. But some people, like I said, even took that to a more extreme degree as well. And then going on to the trainer cards, one thing you might notice from my supporter lineup, I actually played 0 copies of Professor Sycamore. I think it's the first deck in a while I have not played a deck with Sycamore. But honestly, it's a card I just really don't like in some of these Zoroark variants, just because you typically have really large hands at most times throughout the game. So once you've traded a few times, you really can't afford the Sycamore, but you can usually afford to Cynthia or N if you do need to still refresh your hand size. That's why I opted just to cut Sycamore altogether and just play 3 again, 3 Cynthia, that's all we need for draw power. Also playing the 1 copy of Mallow and the 2 copies of Professor Kukui as well. So plenty of ways to get cards out of the deck with this deck. You know, looking at this list, there's only 6 draw supporters total, but when you have 4 Zoroark GX, you can easily start drawing through your deck and, you know, supplementing your draw with other ways. And another thing about the supporters you might note is only 2 copies of Guzma, but you guys have to remember we are playing the Lycanroc GX, which also has Bloodthirsty Eyes to switch our opponent's active. So we have 2 other ways of switching, you know, our opponent's active. So that's why you only really need 2 Guzma with this Lycanroc variant. And then looking at the regular item cards, you know, not too many crazy inclusions. Multi-switch, I think, is kind of you know, a weird card you don't see too often, but I think a card that has really been kind of become a staple in these Zoroark Lycanroc decks, and definitely got put to use for me over my weekend as well, which I'll talk more about in my matchups next in the video too. Only 1 Floatstone, 1 E-Hammer, 1 Rescue Stretcher, 1 Parallel City. You know, we do play a lot of 1 counts, but we do have the 4 Puzzles of Time, so we can reuse a lot of these 1-ofs if need be. So after this event, you know, I had a couple people ask, you know, would I change anything about this list? And honestly, overall, I was pretty happy with it. The only thing I think I really wanted to find room for was a second Floatstone. That would have been a big help at different points in this tournament. And also a card I would have loved to experiment with is actually the Sudowoodo all the way back from Breakpoint. You know, the Sudowoodo's popped up in several different decks, like Buzzwole variants. Also, some Zoroark variants play things like Counter Energy, so that way they can make use of Sudowoodo. So just another good card that's good in the mirror, and also can be good against decks that take big one-hit knockouts and things like that as well. So that was a card, you know, I don't want to say I definitely wanted here, but that was a card I definitely wanted to experiment with. But I think the second Floatstone was the big thing that, you know, if I really could change anything or find extra space for, it would have been that second Floatstone. But overall, pretty happy with the list. Pretty standard. Like I said, not too many really crazy inclusions. Playing the double counters to Buzzwole just to make sure we don't lose to Buzzwole, since I did expect that to be a popular deck at this event. But like I said, overall pretty happy with how the deck performed and the list I settled on. So let's get into my actual matchups, and I'll kind of tell you how my tournament run went. So round 1, I actually right off the bat got paired against Zoroark GX, Golisopod GX. You know, like I said, kind of the big deck people had their eye on going into this event. So definitely a deck I expected to run into at some point. So right off the bat, I'm going to get into a game with it. And at this point in the tournament, you know, it's super early. I forget what time round 1 started. It was like 9:30, maybe even 10 o'clock. But I didn't get much sleep the night before. I remember I was still super groggy. And I know I misplayed so much during this first round. I should have probably got a practice game in just to warm up that morning, but I did not. So anyways, I eventually did tie. My opponent won game 1. They ran pretty well that game. Game 2, my opponent just started with a lone Tapu Koko, and I donked them on like turn 3 or something like that. I forget. And then in game 3, it eventually went to time, and so we did tie because he won game 1, and I won that donk in game 2 as well. So unfortunately, starting off the day with a tie or a loss is never what you want to see. You typically want to take your ties and or losses at the end. You know, once you've already won several games, because, you know, losing or tying this early on is pretty bad because it puts on a lot of pressure to just win the rest of the day. And, you know, it's just not fun to work under that much pressure just from the very beginning of the tournament. But, you know, it's better than a loss, so I'll take it. It could be worse. Next up in round 2, I actually got paired against a local player in my area. Somehow out of, what, like 900,000 people, we ran into each other. So definitely was not expecting that, but he was playing Shining Genesect Venusaur. Definitely not a deck I had much experience against. But luckily, you know, I did play a couple of things to really ensure that I could deal with the matchup. I have the Baby Zoroark, which can, you know, pretty effectively knock out these Genesects. Also, I played the Professor Kukui, so that can enable Zoroark GX to also hit for 140, which means you can knock out Shining Genesects in one hit. And, you know, also, I just think the deck is pretty aggressive, the Zoroark Lycanroc deck, so I felt pretty confident going into this matchup. So, game 1, I actually took pretty, you know, decisively. You know, my deck was just running pretty much how you'd expect. Game 2, I did not get quite as lucky. My opponent had a great start. They had the turn 2 Rare Candy Venusaur and just really started getting set up really dominantly. And me, on the other hand, I was really struggling to get going, and I eventually did lose that game. I scooped that one. I think my opponent had 4 prizes, or I think they had taken 4 prizes. I'd only taken like 1 or 2, so I just scooped, I think it was, and we went on to game 3. And game three, I really forget any specifics as far as how the game was going. I do remember that I was in a pretty good position, and I actually told my opponent, because I knew we were getting low on time, you know what, at this type of tournament you have to go 7-1-1 or 7-2 or better to make day 2 of the tournament. So there's really not a big difference between a loss or a tie, unfortunately, at this point. So I told him, you know what, if it looks like you're going to beat me and we go to time, I'm just going to give you the game, because like I said, it literally basically makes no difference as far as making day 2 if I have a loss or a tie at this point. And so eventually the game, of course, like I expected, did go to a tie. And afterwards, my opponent was gracious enough to, reciprocate what I said and said, do you want me to do the same for you? And he gave me the win. I think just because, like I said, I was doing pretty well in that game. I don't really remember how it ended, but I remember I was in a pretty good position when the game finally did come to an end. So super big shout out to that guy for being gracious enough to give me the win in this particular round. So going into round 3, I actually wasn't feeling that good. Yeah, I technically got a win from round 2, but up to that point, I just wasn't feeling too confident in my deck choice. Like I said, I wasn't feeling that great early on in the day. I was really tired, just groggy, had like a big mental fog just in general, which is definitely not a good thing in a deck that requires so many micro decisions, like figuring out what to trade away, what you want to mallow for, managing all of the one-ofs in my list. So I wasn't feeling too good, but luckily, round 3, I got a more legitimate win. I played against Lycanroc GX Garbodor. Didn't really know how this was going to play out. If my opponent could get the turn 2 Garbotoxin, I felt like that would actually be really big. And just in general, they typically run more ways to outlast me than I do them. They probably play 2 or 3 Acerollas, whereas I only play the one. Yes, I can reuse it with Puzzles of Time, but generally speaking, Glycopod variants are built more to outlast their opponent. They usually are going to win the 2-shot war. So I knew getting a good Dangerous Rogue GX knockout at some point would be good. So that's kind of what I was thinking. I had to really make a good use of my puzzles, make sure I could keep chaining Acerollas when I needed them, also to use a Lycanroc GX at the right time to take a big knockout. But my opponent, he really just didn't have the best games. Round 1, or game 1, I should say, I think he started off okay, but just in the mid to late game, his deck just kind of stalled out. He wasn't drawing into energy, and I ended up winning game 1. Similarly for game 2, he didn't have a good start, but actually a card that put in a lot of work for me was the Corner Rockruff from Guardians Rising. Actually kind of made me wish I played more copies of them. So Corner, it's that attack on the Rockruff from Guardians Rising for a single fighting energy, makes it so that your opponent can't retreat. And my opponent started with a Trubbish, so what I did was I cornered their Trubbish while I was getting set up. So that means, they couldn't retreat into their Glycopod to take a knockout, or into their Tapu Koko, or whatever it may be. So it bought me a few turns, and it actually forced my opponent to do some, less than optimal plays. They had to, at one point, attach a Rainbow Energy to their Trubbish, that way they could Acerola it up. So the Corner Rockruff put in a ton of work for me, and just in general, like I said, my opponent just didn't have the best setup that game either, and I did end up winning that one. So right now I am 2-0-1, so technically undefeated, so I'm feeling a little bit better after getting a more decisive win in round 3. Going on to round 4, I'm getting paired up against a Solgaleo GX Zoroark GX deck. When I saw my opponent shuffling up, I saw some metal energy, so I was thinking, oh cool, I'm playing against Duskmane Necrozma. That's fine, my deck's more aggressive than them, I'm more consistent, I can probably beat them. But then my opponent flips over Cosmogs, and I get a lot more worried, because Solgaleo GX is actually a pretty scary card to deal with, because that has that Sunsteel Strike attack, so they can knock out my Zoroarks in one hit, my Lycanrocs in one hit as well. So if they get a fast Solgaleo GX up and running, the deck is actually kind of scary to deal with. So in game 1, my opponent actually has a pretty explosive start. He has the turn 2 Solgaleo, he has turn 2 Zoroark, he just had a great setup in game 1. And actually, I almost did win game 1 as well. It was actually a pretty close game, but I actually misplayed towards the end. I was basically betting on having a Kukui in deck. That way I could use Lycanroc to bring up his damaged Solgaleo, and use Kukui to boost my damage to finish taking a knockout. But unfortunately, my second Kukui was prized, so I should have been more aware of what was in my deck. So definitely a misplay, but there are a lot of one-ofs in the list, and a lot of things you really just need to manage with this deck. So it was just hard for me I think, just to keep track of everything I had prized and everything I had access to, especially once you factor in things like puzzles into the mix. Sometimes it can be hard to keep track of all your resources. So definitely a big mistake on my part. But you know, it's best 2 out of 3. Going into game 2, I had a much better setup than my opponent. He really struggled to get up and going. I was able to kind of aggressively pick off his Cosmogs and things like that, and just really prevent his setup from ever getting off the ground. And so we end up going to a game 3, and you know, a couple of big things happened. So my opponent ended up going first, which was good for him. I'm sure he laywayed for a Bridget to get set up, of course. So I actually had the choice of, on my first turn, ending or playing Cynthia, I believe it was. I think maybe I started with a couple of basics and I didn't even need the supporter, or maybe my opponent had Parallel City, I forget, but I was having to layway for a draw supporter, I remember. And my opponent laywayed for Bridget, so I was like, you know what? You probably have a draw supporter for next turn. I'm just going to go for the end and try to disrupt your setup a little bit. And my opponent told me he had like a crazy start. So I was actually really excited that I chose to end him instead of playing the Cynthia in this case. That actually really affected his setup a lot. From what I gathered, and that game was actually super close. I forget what happened, but you know, it was down to like the last turn or so. Basically, if I wasn't going to win on the turn that I won, my opponent was going to have game. He basically set up his Giurleo with a Radiant Star with the Giurleo Prism Star, but luckily I had what I needed. I forget what it was, but I ended up winning a super close game 3. So super scary series. The baby Zoroark actually put in some work in this matchup because it forced my opponent to burn all 3 energy with Sunsteel Strike to take a knockout, you know, forcing them into a 7 prize game. You know, them having to burn 3 energy to knock out a 1 prize Pokemon is actually pretty good. So really happy I ran the baby Zoroark in this situation. Really helped out a lot in this matchup. Next up in round 5, I'm playing against yet another Zoroark Golisopod deck. Kind of expected, you know, it's a really popular deck going into this event, so kind of knew I would have to play against a few of these at some point. And, you know, this was actually a super long drawn out game. We actually only finished 1 game in the entire, you know, 50 minutes or however long it was for this round. So my opponent had a super aggressive start. You know, they got up their Zoroarks out pretty quickly, and they were just trading through their deck. And I think my opponent honestly may have been a little too aggressive in certain situations with his trades. He discarded a lot of resources that, you know, I think would have really benefited him more in the late game. And whereas I, on the other hand, I really wasn't drawing through my deck as quickly as my opponent, especially in the early to mid game. I was playing a little bit more conservatively, you know, saving my Acerolas, saving my puzzles. That way I could reuse Acerolas just because I knew my opponent could probably outlast me if we were going to play the 2-shot war. So I knew I had to kind of go that route and basically make use of all my Acerolas, you know, the most amount of times possible. And so my opponent was picking off all of my Rockruffs, doing the smart thing. Similarly for me, I was targeting down his Golispods. Wasn't really too worried about his Zoroarks, you know, saving my enhanced hammers for his Zoroarks while I was, you know, targeting down Golispod. I wanted to clear the field of Golispod. That way I could safely set up Lycanroc GX to kind of sweep and close out the game a little bit. So getting on to the end of the match, it was pretty close, and honestly I felt really confident about the situation I was in. My opponent had a very small deck. He had used all of his puzzles of times. At this point, I cleared all of his Golispods off the field. I think I had him parallel citied even, and I was just feeling really confident about the state of the game, and you know, the fact that I could you know, probably close this one out. I had more resources left than he did, so like I said, I felt really good going to the end of this game. But when my opponent had, I think it was literally like 3 cards in deck, he benches the Resource Management Oranguru, and that's when my heart sank. I completely forgot about that card, because that's going to mean he can actually get resources out of his discard pile back into his deck. So at this point, I had taken 4 prizes, so I only needed to knock out 1 more GX to win. So he pivots into this Oranguru, gets back 3 puzzles of time, puts them on the bottom of his deck, but because he only has like 4 cards in deck or whatever, he can easily just draw right into them. So this was actually pretty bad, because that means he can literally just recycle Guzma twice to win the game. And I, at this point, was out of Guzmas. At this point, I had used all of my puzzles, so I was actually super scared of this. But my opponent, he opts to actually get, you know, he does the resource management, gets his puzzles of time back in his deck as expected, but he chooses to get, I believe it was a grass energy and a field blower off of his puzzles. So what he did, I think he was going more for the mill strategy to deck me out. Because at this point, my discard pile was pretty big. Basically, every basic in my deck was in my discard pile. Even if I attacked a Rangaroo, he parallel cities me to where I can't even knock it out, and he can just safely mill me for the rest of the game. But what he didn't know is I actually had one more basic in my deck. I had the Evolutions Mewtwo. I had not yet played at this point, so that was a card. He saw the Mew EX in my discard, probably assumed I didn't play any other techs to beat Buzzwole, but I also had a Field Blower and Parallel City in my hand at the time, I believe it was. Or no, I don't think I had Parallel City. I think it was just the Field Blower. But he E-hammers my energy. But like I said, I have Field Blower to get rid of his Parallel City. I attach another Double Colorless Energy and draw into the Mewtwo, bench it, and I think play my second Kukui as well to finish taking a knockout on a Rangaroo to win the game. So if my opponent, I think, had just gone for the double Guzma play, he would have won, but based on, what I had used, I think it was still kind of an okay play he went with, but he just didn't know my count of everything since this was only our first game in the series. So unfortunately for him, I had what I needed to combat the mill strategy and knock out this last Aringer to win. So a super crazy, game in that round 5, but I'm feeling pretty good. I'm 401. This is actually one of my better starts to my regionals in a while, so I'm feeling pretty good. I have to go 7-1-1 or 7-2, or better, basically, to make day 2 of the tournament. So I only need to win 3 more, and I'm guaranteed day 2 of the tournament. So next up in round 6, I actually get paired against Austin Vance. He's a player from I believe, the Carolina region. He might be from Georgia. I'm actually not sure, but either the Carolinas or Georgia. I see him at a lot of events. But so I knew Austin was playing. One of my friends told me he was playing Zoroark Lycanroc. So this was going to be my first mirror match of the day. And I knew Austin was a pretty good player. So, I really didn't know how this was going to go. So our game 1, both of us have atrocious starts. I think I just open a Lele and attach a Fighting Energy and pass or something like that. And my opponent, he just opens with, I think, is a Rockruff and nothing else but an N. So he just has to end me, and we both have pretty bad turns for a few turns. And it was just kind of a really awkward game 1. I really forget any specifics about this game after the first few turns, but I did wind up ending game 1. My opponent scooped a little bit into the game once I started to stabilize a bit more than he did. So game 2, unfortunately, my deck did not run very well at all. Austin's deck was running, kind of on all cylinders, and he was able to, take a pretty decisive win. And going into game 3, this one was much more back and forth between us, and there was a couple of crazy turns that each of us had. I remember I had a big turn where I paralleled my opponent, E-hammered him, Bloodthirsty Eyes to bring up his only Zoroark on field and end him to 4 or something like that. So it was this huge epic turn I had to basically mount a comeback, because I think he was ahead at this point, and he ends up drawing a Sycamore or something out of the 4 cards. I was like, you know what, he doesn't run many draw supporters, his only Zoroark is going to be gone from the field. I can hopefully safely end him down to a low hand size, and I'll be good to kind of sweep him. But he ends up drawing just crazy off the 4 cards that he got ended into. So my heart sank a little bit there, and similarly he hit me with this super big turn of his as well, where he ends me to 1, but then I draw the Guzma DCE I need to win for game. I literally only had 1 Guzma and 1 DCE left in deck, and that was my top deck and the 1 card I got off the end. So we had a crazy game 3, and I ultimately won the series as well, which means I am 501 for the day. Like I said, just 2 more wins, and I'm guaranteed day 2 of the tournament. So going into round 7, I get paired up against yet another player from the Carolina region. Actually get paired against Chip Ritchie, aka Trainer Chip, fellow YouTuber, so go check him out if you guys get a chance. But I was actually not excited whatsoever for this matchup, because I knew Chip was playing the Zoroark GX counter energy, toolbox style deck, where you play things like Sudowoodo, Shaman, Mimikyu, etc. to, kind of take these big one-hit knockouts on certain popular Pokemon in the metagame. So I knew this was going to be kind of a tough matchup, because basically I have to take out his Zoroarks, his draw engine, his main attacker, or I can pick off these little one prize tech cards he's playing to beat me, only giving up one prize. So I knew this was going to be kind of a tricky matchup. Our first game was actually really close. We both get down to one prize. I do end up misplaying a little bit. I do remember I like paralleled him, which got rid of his Shaman on the field, which was going to be my win condition to beat him at that point. But I think next turn he had like the Guzma to beat me anyway, so the misplay wound up not really mattering too much in that specific situation. But Chip won a super close game one. And in game two, I just did not have that great of a game. Chip was just burning through his deck. He got Zoroarks up and running pretty easily, whereas my setup was just not nearly as good. You know, I remember a lot of the times I just had kind of like a 1 and 2 card hand. I was forced to do a lot of just like kind of awkward plays to stay in the game, and Chip won a pretty decisive game two. I did misplay against him as well, also regarding a Shaman. I miscalculated my damage to take a knockout on Shaman, and it wound up not being knocked out. Not sure how much it wound up mattering, but you know, definitely was not my best game of the day as far as my quality of play goes. But like I said, my deck just in general was just not setting up as well. Chip even asked me, do you even play Puzzles of Time? Which kind of shows you something. I never really got to make great use of my puzzles and you know, really just get my deck firing off the way it needs to. So unfortunately, I did take an L at this point in tournament. I was actually really sad about that, because if I had won round 7, I could actually safely ID my next 2 rounds to get into day 2. You could go 6-0-3 as well to make day 2, so I was really counting on winning this one. That way I could kind of more safely guarantee getting into day 2 of the tournament. But you know what? I only still need to win 2 more. You know, there's only 2 rounds left in the day, but if I can win those 2, I will be guaranteed day 2 of the tournament. So for round 8, I get paired against a Zoroark GX Gardevoir GX deck. And this is actually a deck I had not tested too much against, but I felt like on paper, you know, I could actually do solid against it. They do have the Gallade, which is actually pretty big because they can knock out my own Zoroark GXs with just a 1 prize attacker, but I felt like the deck was a bit slower than the Lycanroc one. The Lycanroc version has much more potential for early game aggression thanks to Bloodthirsty Eyes, and Dangerous Rogue can take a big one-hit knockout on Gardevoir GX as well if need be. So I felt, you know, okay going into this matchup. So game 1, my opponent gets a quick Gallade into play and, you know, knocks out my active Zoroark GX, but I end up having a Mew EX to return KO the Gallade and ending my opponent. I don't think they actually had a Zoroark in play yet, if I remember correctly, but I remember my opponent just after that didn't have a whole lot to really work with, so they scooped and we go over to game 2. Game 2, I forget how it goes, but I think I mulliganed a couple of times and started Lele without a way to actually bridge it on turn 1. So game 2 was pretty bad for me there as well, and I ended up scooping, I think like 3 turns in. My opponent had just a godly setup, and I was just floundering around, just trying to just get the bare bone essentials into play. So I scooped, that way we would have enough time for game 3. Similarly, yet again for game 3, my deck just really was not working well. I believe I actually started Lele again, if I remember correctly. Didn't have the first turn bridge it or anything like that, and it was just another really bad game. At that point, I was playing for a tie just to better secure potentially getting top 64 if I win my last game, but my opponent ended up having what they needed to win. So at this point, I'm actually pretty bummed, because this second loss means I actually can't make day 2 of the tournament. You know, even if I win my last round, I will be 6-2-1, and that record is just not good enough to make it into day 2. Like I said, you have to be 6-0-3, 7-1-1, 7-2, or something better than that to make day 2 of the tournament. So I'm pretty heartbroken actually, because I had such a good start in this tournament. But you know what? Really, all I need is top 64 to stay on track for my Worlds invite. You know, top 64, you'll get 50 championship points and a half booster box. So I was thinking, you know what? If I can win my last game, you know, I can still end this weekend on a good note. So going into round 9, I get paired against yet another mirror match. It's going to be Zoroark Lycanroc. And starting out in our game 1, I was actually pretty bummed because my opponent had the first turn bridge it. They bridged out everything they needed and got the first turn Parallel City on me, really limiting my potential setup for this game. I actually started with a Lele active, and I had, I think, like an Ultra Ball for a Lele in hand as well. So I could Lele, bridging out literally 2 Pokemon, but then my board state would be like a Lele in the active, Lele on bench, and then like 1 Zorua, 1 Rockruff, and I just did not think that was worth it. So unfortunately, that means I would have to go for a draw supporter or some other different sort of play. But one thing my opponent did, he attached a strong energy to his benched Rockruff. So what I actually opted to do was just bench Lele for Guzma, had DCE in my hand. That way I could take a knockout on his Rockruff at least, because Rockruff and Lycanroc are going to be the big threats against me in this matchup. So I felt like, even though I can't bridge it this turn, I can still at least do a half decent play here. Similarly, I think I had Acerola in my hand at this point as well, so I knew I could kind of stay alive for a few turns and prevent anything crazy from happening. He had a huge turn where he went for the Kukui Choice Band to try to knock out my only remaining Lele that I had. He Kukui traded like 2 or 3 times, but he whiffed the Choice Band, which meant that my Lele did not get knocked out, which means I could stay alive in the game a little bit longer. So after that, I started to stabilize. My opponent, he was drawing through his deck pretty quickly. He was trading away a lot of resources and things that could potentially be good in the late game, whereas, I really hadn't used that much of my deck. I felt like if I could stabilize, I could make a comeback. I thought about actually scooping at one point just because my opponent did have such a dominant setup, but I felt like, what, I have enough resources left in deck that if I can stabilize, I could potentially mount a comeback here. And so actually, that's kind of what happened in game 1. I eventually did start to stabilize. I got Zoroarks in play, Lycanroc, etc., and it actually came down really close at the end of this game. Basically, my opponent just needed an energy to use Dangerous Rogue to knock out my last remaining Pokemon. The turn prior, I had puzzled for, I think it was like an E-Hammer and a Guzma or something. But basically, my opponent knew I had Guzma in hand, ready to go to win if he did not knock out my active to win the game. So he Cynthia'd, got a bunch of cards out of his deck. He didn't have that many cards left in deck at this point, but he still had like 2 or 3 energy in there, so I knew my odds weren't great. I actually pretty much expected to lose this game 1, but my opponent played the Cynthia and traded and still did not hit the energy, which means that I had Guzma in hand, and I was able to win this really long, drawn-out game 1. Game 2, we started to play it, but then time got called, I think just like 2 turns into the game, and my opponent would not have had enough turns to actually win the game at that point. So since I won game 1, I was the victor of the series, which means I ended the day 6-2-1, which I was actually pretty happy about. That's really all I needed out of this weekend to stay on track. Like I said, of course, I wanted to make day 2 of the tournament. That way I could walk away with some money, maybe some extra packs or something like that. But you know what? Like I said, as long as I get top 64, I walked away with championship points and the half box of Ultra Prism. So I really can't be too bummed about how my weekend went. So after all the standings got posted, I found out I actually finished 49th at this tournament. So that means I did make top 64. At the last regional in Collinsville, I went 6-2-1 and I whiffed top 64. I think I got like 88th or something like that. So I was actually happy that I did make the cut this time. That way I got some more championship points and some packs this time. And again, even though I am bummed about not making day 2, I was actually pretty happy. This is technically my best finish of the season so far. At all of my other regionals, I think I've finished like between like 50 and 80 something, so this is actually my best finish yet by a few spots. So you know what, it was actually a pretty good weekend for me. The deck overall performed pretty well. Had a couple games where it just kind of stalled out and didn't treat me that well, but overall I think it was a really good pick for this weekend. Had a solid Golisopod matchup. I played several outs against Buzzwole. Just generally I think it was a solid deck for this weekend, and overall I'm pretty happy that I played it. But I will say this about the deck. This was actually the first time I've played a Zoroark variant for a major event like this, which means 9 rounds of best 2 out of 3. And I think it's actually pretty difficult to play a Zoroark variant for that many rounds just because there's so many micro decision making that goes into all of your different plays. There's so many different targets you could potentially trade away, especially when you factor in things like Mallow. That opens up a lot of potential for different plays. Same thing with Kukui and also Lycanroc GX. There's different targets you can Bloodthirsty Eyes. So there's just a lot of different micro decision making that goes into this, especially also with Puzzles of Time. So to be honest, I think I actually probably should have picked a different deck. I don't regret my deck choice just because I did well at the event, but honestly in hindsight I think it would have been safer to play something like Buzzwole or something a little bit more mindless for 9 rounds. I think I would have felt a little bit more comfortable, but like I said, overall the deck did treat me well, so I can't be that bummed about how I did. But just a word of warning, if you are thinking about taking a Zoroark variant to a major event like this, just be prepared for 9 rounds of lots of micro decision making to be made. Just make sure that you are comfortable with something like that if you are going to play this. So like I said, I did finish 49th, but let's look at what actually went on to make top 8 at this tournament. So looking at the final standings, we have Buzzwole Lycanroc at the number 8 spot, Sylveon GX at number 7, Goiseon Zoroark at number 6, Zoroark Gardevoir at number 5, Buzzwole Lycanroc at number 4, Greninja Break at number 3, Buzzwole Lycanroc at number 2 and 1 as well. So just looking at these final standings, a lot of interesting things going on. You know, after Buzzwole Garb did so well at Collinsville, I kind of expected that to be the more popular Buzzwole variant that would emerge. But if you look at the top 8 standings, Buzzwole Lycanroc seemed to be the more dominant version of the deck at this tournament. So maybe they just opted to go old school with Buzzwole Lycanroc, since Zoroark, specifically Golisopod and Lycanroc, had so much hype going into this event. They were like, hey, Buzzwole Lycanroc just beats these, these Zoroark variants. It's so aggressive, so let's just play that. So maybe that was the line of thought. It's definitely still a really solid deck, but also there's a couple of other really interesting decks that made this top 8. Sylveon was really interesting. You know, Sylveon has performed pretty decently at events in the past. You know, my boy Xander Bennett from the Meta Podcast has been playing Sylveon, making like top 64 and top 128 at a lot of these regionals. But Sylveon, I think, had really failed to secure a really good placing at these events, but it's cool to see someone actually do it. I forget the player who did wind up playing Sylveon, but congrats to them for making it so far with a deck that weird. Same thing for Glaceon Zoroark. That was a deck I think a lot of people just completely wrote off after Glaceon's poor performance at Collinsville. Andrew Rambolt from the Charizard Lounge did day 2 with Glaceon Garbodor, but like I said, Glaceon Zoroark was kind of the more hyped version going into that event, and it kind of flopped. So just really surprising to see that it actually did make it all the way into the top 8 of this tournament. But then even more surprising was Greninja Break wound up being at the number 3 spot. Greninja, also a deck that had a lot of attention on it going into Collinsville. People were really excited to try out Cynthia in the deck just to give it a bit of a consistency boost. But, maybe that's why it did better at this event. I think Greninja had a lot of attention on it going into Collinsville, so people were ready with their Giratina promos to counter it. But maybe at this one, since Greninja didn't do well at the previous event, people weren't playing Giratina promo, which means that Greninja Break has more of a chance to shine. But I'm just surprised it made it through such a field of so many Buzzwole decks. That's really what I'm most surprised about. But congrats to them for making it so deep into the tournament with a deck like that. But yeah, guys, just to recap a little bit, really happy with how this weekend turned out. Unfortunately, like I said multiple times now, I did not make day 2 of the tournament, which is, well, of course I really wanted, but I was still happy with my performance. Wound up getting 49th. Like I said, I walked away with championship points and some booster packs of Ultra Prism, so it was a pretty solid weekend. Got to see plenty of friends that I don't get to see outside of Pokemon tournaments. And also, too, just a big shout out to everyone in the community that came up and said hi, who watches Rare Candy or is a patron or has a Rare Candy merchandise or anything like that. I saw some Rare Candy shirts, playmats, etc. at this tournament. So really awesome to see a lot of those things out in the wild and you guys using them. So that means, so much that you guys are supporting this channel. If there's any cons to this weekend, I'd say that the biggest thing was just honestly how this event was run. Definitely not one of the better run events I've been to. We got out at I think it was 12:30 or 12 o'clock is when the event finally ended. Normally, most regionals I've been to have finished around maybe about 10 o'clock. Maybe 10:30 is when we leave. So this one was just super late getting out. This one actually started earlier than other regionals as well. I believe the doors opened at 7:30, which was definitely not fun. That means I didn't get as much sleep as I'd wanted to, and I had to stay later than I wanted to. So just really not happy with how the tournament was run overall. But like I said, the weekend itself was pretty solid. But yeah, guys, that's going to pretty much conclude it for this tournament report. As usual, feel free to like and subscribe, and if you guys can support this channel by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/rarecandytcg, or by picking up something from our online store at rarecandytcg.com, it would mean a lot. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you for the next one.